It started about 4 hours into the flight, somewhere over the Atlantic. We'd finished our second meal service, and the cabin lights were dimmed for the overnight stretch. The passengers were calm, some reading under the soft glow of their seat lights, others drifting into half-sleep. It was quiet, the kind of steady rhythm you settle into on long-haul flights. I remember thinking how smoothly everything had gone so far, especially for a nearly 10-hour route. Then, without warning, something shifted. It began with Lucia. She was preparing the beverage carts for the next service and suddenly froze mid-motion. She pressed her hand to her forehead and leaned against the galley counter, whispering that she felt dizzy. At first, I thought it was just fatigue. Long flights can mess with your body in strange ways. I told her to take a sip of water and rest for a minute. But before she could sit down, Javier, who was arranging trays beside her, complained that his vision felt off, like the light in the galley was too bright even though it was dim. Within seconds, he looked pale, almost gray. I was reaching out to help when a wave of nausea hit me, too, sharp and sudden, like stepping into a space where the air wasn't right. My stomach tightened, my skin felt clammy, and a faint buzzing started at the base of my skull. I remember grabbing the edge of the counter to steady myself, trying not to draw attention from the passengers. My first thought was food poisoning, but it didn't make sense. We hadn't eaten anything the passengers hadn't, and none of the passengers seemed affected. Lucia's lips were trembling, her breathing uneven. She said she felt like she was freezing even though the cabin temperature was steady. Javier sat on the galley floor, pressing his hands to his temples, saying he could feel his heartbeat inside his head. I told him to stay put and reached for my interphone to call the lead attendant at the front of the cabin, but my voice sounded distant in my own ears, as if I were speaking underwater. When the lead came over to check on us, she immediately noticed the change in the air. "It feels heavy," she said quietly, frowning. The galley smelled faintly metallic, like after a lightning strike. She thought maybe a power unit was overheating, but the smell wasn't strong enough to suggest burning or short-circuiting. Still, to be safe, we checked for any heat coming from the ovens, carts, or power panels. Everything looked normal. We tried to move around, thinking fresh air circulation might help. Strangely, when I stepped into the aisle toward the rear lavatories, the symptoms eased just a little. My breathing steadied, and the nausea faded. But when I turned back toward the galley, it all came crashing in again. The dizziness, the pressure in my chest, and the strange electric tingle across my skin. At that point, I started feeling something deeper than fear. It was confusion mixed with a sense that something unseen was pressing on us, like standing near a powerful magnet. I remember touching the galley counter again, and it felt faintly warm, but not in a normal way. It was an inconsistent, pulsing warmth. Lucia had tears in her eyes. She kept asking if she was going to faint. I told her no, that it was just the altitude, though even as I said it, I didn't believe myself. The captain called over the intercom, asking for a situation update. We told him 3 crew members were feeling ill, but that the passengers were fine. He asked about any odor, smoke, or electrical malfunction. When we said no, he sounded puzzled. "Keep monitoring it," he said. "I'll notify Medlink and see if they recommend any action." We all knew what that meant. If it got worse, we'd divert. But diverting mid-Atlantic is no small thing, so we tried to keep calm and carry on. For the next hour, the symptoms came and went in strange waves. One moment I'd feel stable enough to pour water for a passenger who'd rung the call bell, and the next I'd have to grip the seat back to stop my knees from giving out. My head throbbed behind my eyes. Every time the cabin intercom crackled, it sent a sharp pain through my skull, like the sound itself was too intense. We checked the other crew in different sections. They were fine, completely normal. No one else had nausea or headaches. No one felt the temperature fluctuations or that strange heaviness in the air. It was only the 3 of us working in the aft galley. That realization made it even more unsettling. Lucia eventually sat on a jump seat, pale and sweating. She whispered that her fingertips felt like they were tingling. Javier had gone quiet, his eyes half closed, muttering that the noise from the galley lights was driving him crazy. When I asked what he meant, he said, "Can't you hear that hum?" I listened, but all I heard was the low drone of the engines and the soft ventilation. Then, faintly, I caught it too, a high-pitched tone, almost like feedback from an old TV. It wasn't loud, but it was constant, just at the edge of perception. The captain later told us he checked the aircraft systems and found no electrical issues or cabin pressure anomalies. Everything read perfectly normal on his instruments. But in that small space at the back of the plane, nothing felt normal. I kept thinking about radiation. It sounds paranoid, but flight crews are trained to understand altitude exposure, cosmic rays, and the effects of solar activity. Sometimes, during strong solar storms, radiation levels at cruising altitude can spike. But this felt too specific, too localized, to be a natural event. If it were cosmic radiation, the whole cabin would have been affected, not just the three of us. By the time we started descending into São Paulo, the symptoms were easing. As the plane descended and the air thickened, the nausea faded almost completely. My head still pounded, but the pressure in my chest lifted and I could finally breathe normally again. When the wheels touched down, it was as if a switch flipped. My body started to feel like mine again. Lucia smiled weakly and said, "Whatever that was, I hope it stays in the sky." We thought that would be the end of it, just a weird one-off incident. But it was only the beginning, because when we were checked later by the airport medical team, what they found didn't match anything ordinary. Our blood work showed radiation exposure levels that no one could explain, and in the logs there was no record of any malfunction, leak, or cosmic event that could justify it. That moment on the ground, standing in the hospital corridor, holding the printed results in trembling hands, was when I realized something deeply wrong had happened up there. Something the instruments couldn't see, but our bodies had felt. The strange part was how confined it all seemed. Whatever was happening, it was trapped in that narrow space at the back of the aircraft, the aft galley. Once I left that section, the feeling would fade within minutes, like walking out of a fog. The moment I returned, it hit again, heavy and immediate. It wasn't just me. Lucia and Javier noticed it too. The pattern was unmistakable. We tried to make sense of it while keeping things calm. The rest of the cabin was fine, passengers reading, sleeping, or stretching quietly in the aisles. The air there felt clean, normal, but the galley air seemed different, as if charged. The temperature was technically normal according to the control panel, but to us it felt cold and damp, almost metallic. Lucia said she could taste something strange in the air. "Like coins," she murmured, rubbing her lips. Javier thought it was the water boiler acting up again, so he unplugged it and ran a check. But it wasn't the source. Nothing smelled burnt or overheated. All the equipment showed green indicators. The coffee machines, ovens, and chillers, all normal. And yet, the second we stayed too long in that space, the symptoms came crawling back. I remember stepping into the aisle to distribute bottled water. My body started to calm down almost instantly. The dizziness eased, and my stomach stopped churning. It was so clear that I actually tested it on purpose. I walked back into the galley, waited, and within seconds, the nausea hit again. I stepped out, and it faded. It was that precise. We started to treat it like an invisible boundary. None of us wanted to stay in there for more than a minute or two. When a passenger requested something from the galley, we'd take turns darting in quickly to grab it and coming right back out. It must have looked odd from the cabin, 3 crew members avoiding their own workspace like it were haunted. At one point, Lucia leaned against the storage compartment and whispered, "It's like the air here's alive." I wanted to laugh it off, but she was right. There was an odd sensation of vibration, not from the engines but from the walls themselves, subtle but constant. When I pressed my hand to the galley panel, I could feel it, like static pulsing through metal. Javier thought it could be a ventilation issue, maybe some imbalance in the air pressure ducts. He radioed the flight deck, and the captain confirmed that all environmental controls were reading fine. The filters, airflow, and temperature, all within normal range. Still, the strange boundary persisted. We began keeping notes in our log, marking times and symptoms like some small in-flight experiment. Between 2, 10, and 3 UTC, all three of us experienced the same cycle: nausea, headache, and dizziness whenever we entered the aft galley. Between 3:15 and 3:30, the symptoms eased slightly, then came back stronger. There was no pattern tied to turbulence, altitude changes, or meal service. It was just there, waiting, invisible but undeniable. At one point, I caught my reflection in the galley window and froze. My face was pale, my lips faintly blue. I could see the sweat on my forehead despite the cool cabin. I turned to tell Lucia, but she looked just as bad. Even Javier, who tried to keep a sense of humor, had stopped joking. He was breathing heavily, his shirt damp, his eyes glassy. Still, when we left the galley to check on passengers, everything appeared fine. A family in row 58 was asleep, 2 businessmen were watching movies, and the cabin temperature felt perfectly normal. That contrast made it even more unsettling. It was as if the air inside the galley belonged to a different world altogether. We tested one more thing. We switched off the power to every non-essential device in the galley. The lights, ovens, chillers, everything went dark. For a few moments, the air felt clearer, lighter. Lucia smiled weakly, thinking it was over. But less than a minute later, the headache crept back, sharper than before. Turning off the equipment had done nothing. I tried to distract myself by talking to a passenger near the rear lavatory. While speaking, I realized how much easier it was to breathe. The nausea was completely gone. It didn't feel psychological. It was too immediate, too consistent. I began to think about the aircraft's structure, wondering if maybe radiation from an external source was somehow hitting that part of the fuselage more directly. It sounded absurd, but it was the only thing that made sense. When I returned to check on Lucia, she was sitting on the floor, pale and trembling. Javier was kneeling beside her, his hand pressed against the metal paneling, as if trying to feel a pulse. He looked up at me and said, "It's like something's under the skin of the plane." That line stuck with me long after we landed, because standing there, in that cold pocket of air that no sensor could explain, it really did feel like something unseen was moving just beneath the surface, something that didn't belong there, but had chosen that small corner of the sky to reveal itself. The first sign that it wasn't just us came from the equipment. The galley lights began to flicker, not a gentle pulse like you get with voltage fluctuations, but a sharp, erratic stutter, like a warning. The flicker was followed by a faint crackling sound in the interphone, the one we used to contact the cockpit. Lucia picked it up to call the lead attendant, but all she got was static and a low hum that rose and fell like an old radio struggling to find a station. She frowned, tapped the receiver, and tried again. Same result. Then the ovens switched on. We all froze. None of us had touched them. The control lights blinked for a few seconds, heating indicators flashing as if someone had pressed the start button. Javier went over to shut them off, and as soon as he touched the panel, they powered down on their own. We exchanged looks, half expecting to smell smoke or ozone, but there was nothing, just the faint metallic scent that had been lingering since the symptoms began. Lucia whispered that she could feel vibrations through the floor. I crouched down and tried to sense it too, but it wasn't exactly vibration. It was more like a low-frequency thrum, something deep, alive, and constant. It didn't match the usual background hum of the engines. It was separate, closer, and somehow inside the structure of the galley itself. The intercom suddenly clicked again, this time followed by a burst of loud feedback. It made us all wince and cover our ears. The sound lasted only a second before cutting out completely. The captain later told us they'd received no call from our end during that moment. From his perspective, the interphone was silent. For a few minutes, nothing else happened. The air felt thick, like it was holding its breath. Then, as I was checking the power outlet near the service panel, I saw a faint blue shimmer run across the metal edge of the counter. It wasn't a reflection. There was nothing nearby bright enough to cause it. It lasted just a heartbeat, like a spark that didn't fully ignite. I stepped back, stunned, and Lucia saw it too. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice shaking. Javier didn't answer. He was staring at the ceiling where the fluorescent strips were dimming and brightening in uneven bursts. It was the most unsettling silence I've ever experienced. The galley, usually filled with hums and clatters, was dead quiet between those pulses of interference. Every sound, the air vents, the distant chatter of passengers, even the steady drone of the engines, seemed muffled. It was as if we were sealed inside a bubble that filtered out the rest of the plane. Javier checked the circuit breakers. All normal. He pulled one open, reseated it, then stepped back and said, "It's not electrical. It can't be." His voice didn't sound convinced. At that point, the lead attendant arrived again, clearly concerned. She asked if we were sure there wasn't a smell of overheating wires or a power surge. We told her no, that it wasn't heat, it was something else, something we couldn't name. She put her hand on the galley wall and frowned. "It's vibrating," she said softly. We all nodded. She tried to radio the cockpit herself, but the connection cut out twice before she could finish her sentence. The captain's voice came through distorted, his words breaking in and out. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything returned to normal. The lights stabilized, the hum faded, the intercom cleared up. It was as if the aircraft had taken a deep breath and exhaled. Lucia started crying quietly. She said her ears were ringing, and her skin felt like it was burning from the inside. I wasn't far behind her. The headache that had been pounding at my temples intensified, like a pressure building just behind my eyes. I felt sick again, weaker this time. I remember pressing my palm against the counter for support and feeling the faintest static shock. It wasn't strong, but it left a tingling that crawled up my arm. The strange part was how immediate the pain was, like my nerves were overreacting to something they couldn't handle. We didn't dare use the galley after that. The lead ordered us to seal it off and move the carts forward. The passengers were still fine, chatting, sleeping, laughing. None of them felt a thing. It was only we, the ones who'd stood in that charged space, who felt like we'd been drained. Later, the captain came back to check for himself. He stepped into the galley, ran his hand over the same counter we had touched, and said he didn't feel anything unusual. But within 5 minutes, he said his vision blurred slightly, and he got a brief headache. That was all. After the flight, when maintenance teams came aboard, we told them everything. The lights, the hum, the static, the blue shimmer. They scanned the galley panels for current leaks, grounding faults, and even arc discharges. Every system checked out perfectly. No shorts, no surges, no irregularities. But one of the technicians, while running his instruments near the same counter, paused and frowned. He said the readings showed electromagnetic interference spikes, short bursts of high frequency that shouldn't exist on a powered-down system. They lasted a fraction of a second each time, then disappeared. When he moved his sensor a few inches away, the readings dropped to 0. He looked at us and said quietly, "If I didn't know better, I'd say something external pulsed through here." The words hung in the air, and for a long moment none of us spoke. We all felt it again, the sense that whatever had touched that space during the flight wasn't just a malfunction or an electrical glitch. It was something that passed through, invisible but real, and it had chosen that small, metal-lined corner of the plane to leave its mark. When we landed in São Paulo, I expected the symptoms to fade and stay gone. For the most part, they did, but a dull ache stayed behind my eyes, like I'd stared too long into bright light. Lucia still looked weak. Javier was sweating through his uniform, even though the terminal air was cool. We all figured it was just exhaustion, maybe dehydration from the long night. But the airline's protocol required medical checks for any in-flight illness, so airport doctors met us at the gate. They started with the basics: blood pressure, pulse, and oxygen saturation. Everything seemed ordinary, until Lucia mentioned her skin felt like it was burning. The doctor used a handheld radiation meter as part of the standard screening, more out of habit than suspicion. The device beeped once, then again louder. He frowned, thinking it was a malfunction, and tried it on himself. Nothing. Then on me. It chirped again, on Javier the same. No one said anything for a few seconds. You could feel the unease spreading through the small medical room. The doctor exchanged a look with his colleague and quietly told us they'd need to run a more detailed test. They drew blood samples and placed us in a side room while they processed the results. We sat there in silence, listening to the hum of fluorescent lights. When the doctor came back, his expression told us what we needed to know before he spoke. "Your readings are high," he said carefully. "Not dangerously so, but definitely higher than what we'd expect from a single flight." He paused, probably weighing how much to say. "You've been exposed to an unusual amount of radiation." Lucia laughed nervously. "Like cosmic rays?" she asked. The doctor nodded but didn't look convinced. "That would be the first guess," he said. "But if it were cosmic radiation, everyone on board would show similar levels, not just 3 of you." He asked if we had worked near any specialized equipment, medical cargo, or lithium batteries. We told him no. The galley was just a standard setup: coffee makers, ovens, chillers, and power panels. Nothing that could emit radiation. He looked genuinely puzzled. By the time airline management arrived, the tests were being repeated by a second team to rule out error. The results came back almost identical. My exposure levels were roughly 3 times higher than normal flight crew limits. Lucia's and Javier's were about the same. The rest of the crew, including the lead attendant who had stepped into the galley only briefly, showed normal readings. The airline's operations manager called the captain into the room. He confirmed that all cockpit radiation sensors used to detect solar or cosmic bursts had shown normal levels during the flight. There had been no alerts, no solar flare warnings, nothing in the global aviation logs. That's when the questions began. Had we handled anything unusual? Did any passenger carry electronic equipment or scientific cargo? Did we see sparks, flashes, anything resembling plasma discharge? We said no to all of it. Everything had appeared perfectly normal, except how it felt. They sent us to a local hospital for full-body scans, mostly to be cautious. The results showed no immediate harm, though one technician noted localized energy deposition patterns in the upper body that he couldn't explain. In simpler terms, it looked like we'd been exposed unevenly, as if something had radiated us from one direction for a brief moment. That night, lying in a hotel bed with the curtains drawn and the city lights blinking through the gaps, I kept replaying the flight in my head. The metallic air, the static shocks, the faint blue shimmer. It all seemed connected now, though none of it fit into any known category. I tried to reason through it, maybe a small leak in an old microwave component, or interference from a satellite transmission. But those possibilities would have shown up on the maintenance logs. When the results came through officially, they triggered an internal report. The aircraft was grounded the next morning for a full inspection. The engineers said they would run radiation surveys throughout the cabin, focusing on the aft galley. We were told not to speak to the press, and we didn't. None of us wanted attention. We just wanted an explanation. In the following days, the airline doctors monitored us closely. Our vitals returned to normal, though the headaches lingered. I noticed small red patches on my wrists where I had leaned on the metal counter during the flight, like faint sunburns. They faded within a week. The doctors couldn't say for sure what caused them. The strangest part was hearing that no passenger, not even those seated closest to the galley, showed any sign of exposure. They were all perfectly fine. Whatever had touched us had ignored everyone else. When we finally met again, me, Lucia, and Javier, it was at a cafe near the hotel. None of us wanted to talk about it at first. Then Lucia asked the question hanging in the air since that night. "Do you think it was the plane?" she said. "Or something outside it?" Javier looked down at his coffee, then said, "If it were the plane, they'd have found something by now." He wasn't wrong. I tried to laugh, but the sound came out hollow. Because deep down, I already knew, whatever had passed through that galley didn't leave any trace the instruments could find. It only left its mark on us. The aircraft stayed grounded for nearly 2 weeks. Iberia sent its top maintenance and engineering teams to inspect every inch of the Airbus A340. Radiation specialists from a European aviation safety lab were also called in. The investigation logs later showed they ran over 150 separate tests, surface scans, electromagnetic readings, radiation sweeps, and even material integrity checks on the galley panels. Nothing came back abnormal. The report said it plainly: no mechanical, electrical, or environmental irregularities detected. Yet something had happened. We knew it. The engineers started with the obvious possibilities. They checked for faulty wiring near the aft galley, thinking a damaged insulation line might be emitting stray current or electromagnetic pulses. Everything tested within limits. They inspected the ovens, the chillers, and even the waste compactor, pulling out panels and examining circuit boards under UV light. No burn marks, no melted insulation, no corrosion. It was as if the space had been untouched. Then came the more advanced tests. A technician named Duarte told us quietly that his handheld electromagnetic sensor had picked up brief interference spikes when he passed it near the galley floor panel, right under the counter where Lucia had first felt sick. He said the spikes were short, less than a second, but strong enough to register on the spectrum analyzer. They couldn't trace the source. When they repeated the test the next day, the readings were gone. No spikes, no hum, just silence. By the third inspection day, the team started looking for external explanations. They contacted air traffic control, satellite tracking stations, and even weather services to check if the aircraft might have passed through a region of high electromagnetic activity. There were no reports of solar radiation bursts, auroral interference, or geomagnetic storms. The skies that night had been calm. Meanwhile, the airline's medical department asked if they could bring in a physicist from Madrid to interview us. He was an older man, polite but precise. He asked questions that made my skin crawl about what the air felt like, whether we heard buzzing, and if we experienced pressure differentials in the inner ear. When I told him it felt like the space itself was vibrating, he just nodded slowly and wrote something down. He mentioned something called localized EM transients, rare bursts of electromagnetic energy that can occur when charged particles interact with metallic structures, sometimes in high-altitude conditions. But he admitted there was no record of such events ever happening inside a pressurized cabin. If it did, he said, you would expect instrument disruption, yet your cockpit data remained clean. We asked him, half-jokingly, whether it could have been radiation from space. He didn't laugh. Not impossible, he said, but it would need to focus precisely on that galley for the duration of your symptoms. That's unlikely. Radiation spreads. It doesn't localize. Then he paused, unless it wasn't from outside. That silence stretched longer than I expected. A week later, the maintenance lead shared something off the record. During one of their overnight checks, the team had left the galley power systems live while running diagnostics. Around 2 a.m., they recorded intermittent electromagnetic spikes again, strong enough to distort nearby radio frequencies. They traced it to a panel near the galley's left wall. When they opened it, everything inside was pristine. Not a single fault line or loose connection. They even replaced the wiring harness anyway. The next day, the spikes vanished again. Lucia wanted to see the aircraft before it was cleared to fly. The airline allowed us on board under supervision. Walking back into that galley was surreal. Everything looked the same: the stainless steel counters, the storage compartments, the ovens, but the space felt wrong, like walking into a room where you'd once been afraid. I touched the same panel that had made my skin tingle mid-flight. It was cool and still, nothing unusual, yet I could almost feel an echo of that pressure, faint and unprovable. Before the aircraft returned to service, the engineers performed one final test. They replaced several of the galley's electrical components, reshielded the wiring, and logged it as preventive maintenance. They couldn't write unexplained interference in an official report, so they called it a suspected electrical anomaly. When I asked Duarte if he believed that's what it really was, he gave a tired smile. "We fixed what we could see," he said. "The rest," he shrugged. In the weeks that followed, the airline quietly rotated that aircraft onto shorter regional routes, avoiding long-haul polar paths. No one said it out loud, but I think they didn't want to risk another incident mid-ocean. As for the three of us, our radiation levels returned to normal within a few months. The headaches faded, though Lucia said she still sometimes woke up with a faint ringing in her ears, the same pitch as the hum we'd heard that night. Javier eventually transferred to another fleet, preferring to stay off the A340Ss. I stayed. Partly out of stubbornness, partly because flying was all I'd ever known, but every time I step into a galley now, I listen. Not for passengers, not for the intercom, but for that subtle hum, that almost silent vibration that once filled the air like something alive. Because sometimes, when the cabin is quiet at cruising altitude and the engines fall into their steady rhythm, I swear I can feel it again, the faint pulse under the metal, reminding me that some things in the sky don't want to be explained. Weeks turned into months, and life on the line slowly returned to normal. Flight 812 became just another number in the airline's records, buried beneath routine flights and new schedules. Officially, the report called it a minor electrical interference and crew fatigue incident. Unofficially, everyone who had been there knew that wasn't the truth. There was no technical answer, no fault to fix, no malfunction to blame. Three of us had fallen sick in the same place at the same time, felt the same invisible pressure, and showed the same unexplained radiation levels. The aircraft had been taken apart piece by piece, and still, nothing had surfaced. It was as if the event had erased its own footprints. I sometimes think about that night, about the soft flicker of the lights, the humming air, and the way our bodies seemed to know something was wrong before any machine did. Planes are built to measure everything: pressure, temperature, current, vibration. But whatever passed through that galley didn't register on a single instrument. It lived outside the limits of what our equipment could see. Lucia eventually left flying altogether. She said she couldn't shake the memory of how the air felt in that moment, thick and electric, like standing too close to a live wire. Javier switched fleets and rarely spoke about it again. I stayed. Maybe because I needed to believe that the sky still made sense, that there was an explanation waiting out there, hidden in the static between our instruments and whatever else moves through those high, cold altitudes. Sometimes, during night flights, when the cabin goes silent and the passengers are asleep, I find myself glancing toward the aft galley. The hum of the aircraft blends with the wind outside, and for a moment, it feels almost the same, like a faint charge in the air, something just out of reach. And every time it happens, I remember what the physicist said before leaving São Paulo. Not everything that touches you leaves a trace you can measure. Flight 812 taught me that some things in the sky don't follow the rules of turbulence, weather, or machinery. Some things pass through quietly, unnoticed, leaving only the body's memory behind, a warning that whatever's up there isn't always meant to be understood.